John here from bootcamp.com. Welcome to another video. In today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at an overview of the sensory process, as well as discussing the different neurons which are going to be involved in transmitting signal from the body to the brain. So if you want, you can pause and take a look at the outline, but let's just get started. So when we're talking about sensation, it's important to differentiate what type of sensation we're talking about. Now, sensation is broken down into 5 different senses. We have smell, vision, taste, sound, and touch. Smell, this is olfaction. This is going to be processed in our olfactory cortex, which is going to be found right here, found on the temporal lobe. Now, vision, this is processed by the primary visual cortex, which is going to be found in the occipital lobe, just surrounding the calcarine sulcus back here. Taste or gustation, this is going to be found or interpreted in the gustatory cortex, which is going to be found on our insular lobe, right around here. Sound, now that's going to be processed in our primary auditory cortex, which is also located on the temporal lobe, right around here. And then finally, we have touch sensation, and this is going to be the focus for the remainder of the lessons following. And this is going to be processed in the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe, which is going to be found right here. So it's important to note that all sensory information is going to be processed through the thalamus first, with the exception of olfaction. This does not pass through the thalamus, but these sensory modalities pass through the thalamus in order to be sorted and processed and then distributed to their respective cortices in order to be perceived by the brain. So when we're talking about touch sensation, we have 2 major pathways which we're going to be covering. We have the spinothalamic pathway. Now, you may have also heard this referred to as the anterior lateral system. And we also have the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. Now, these 2 pathways carry different types of information. The spinothalamic pathway, this is going to carry nociception, which is basically pain perception. It's also going to cover or carry temperature and crude touch. So this is more general, undiscriminative touch. Now, the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, this carries discriminative touch. Now, an example of this would be, let's say you tell someone to close their eyes and you take their finger and you poke it with a pin in 2 different places. They will be able to tell that you poke them at 2 different points on their finger because they have a large concentration of these discriminative sensory receptors found in this area. Whereas if you perform the same 2-point prick test on the back, you don't have as many discriminative sensory receptors there. So it might seem like you poke them in the exact same spot, even though you poke them in 2 different spots. So that is discriminative touch. And we also have process of vibration and pressure, as well as proprioception. So knowing kind of where the body and the limbs are in space and with respect to one another. So now let's take a closer look at the primary somatosensory cortex and look at its somatotopic organization. You can see the somatosensory cortex has different areas for different parts of the body which it will perceive sensation for. So our legs and feet are going to be found towards the midline, as well as our trunk. Our hands and palm, these are going to be found more towards the middle of the primary somatosensory cortex. And then our face sensation, this is going to be found towards the most lateral and inferior aspect of the somatosensory cortex. Now, it's also important to note that the left primary somatosensory cortex is going to interpret information coming from the right side of the body, and the right primary somatosensory cortex will interpret information coming from the left side of the body. So there's a decussation or a crossing at some point along these pathways. So now let's go back to our cross-section of the spinal cord and identify the sensory pathways that we can see here. In the previous videos, we looked at the motor pathways, which are indicated here in red. Now we're going to identify
these sensory pathways right here. So starting off first, we have our dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. We have our fasciculus gracilis as well as our fasciculus cuneatus. So our fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, these are found in our dorsal column. So this entire structure back here is our dorsal white matter column. Our gracilis is going to be found towards the midline right here, and our cuneatus is going to be found just lateral to that. Now, a way that you can differentiate which one is the gracilis and which one is the cuneatus is that the gracilis, this is going to be carrying sensory information from the lower limbs. So all this information, as the spinal cord ascends up, this is going to be the first to come in. So it makes sense that that is going to be found towards the midline. As the spinal cord comes up, we're then going to have sensory information coming from the upper limbs and joining and building onto that dorsal column. So that's where the fasciculus cuneatus is going to carry that sensory information from the upper limb. Now, a way that you can remember the fasciculus cuneatus carries information from the upper limb is that it has a U in it. So you can see fasciculus cuneatus, U, upper limb. This indicates, or this can be a helpful memory aid, that this is carrying information from the upper limb. And also, this is carrying information from the cervical region. So you could say C, cuneatus, cervical. That's how you can remember that the fasciculus cuneatus carries information from the upper limb, and then by default, the fasciculus gracilis carries information from the lower limb. And you can also see gracilis has an L in it. So that can be an indication that that's coming from the lower limb. Next up, we have our anterior lateral system, or our anterior and lateral spinothalamic pathways. Now, our lateral spinothalamic pathway, that's going to be this big one found right here. And this wraps around sort of the lateral aspect of the ventral horn. And our anterior spinothalamic pathway, that's going to be this one found right here. So you can see the spinothalamic pathway has kind of the C shape wrapping around the ventral horn, and then the anterior aspect is going to be found just anterior to the lateral spinothalamic tract. Then finally, we have our spinocerebellar pathways. We have a dorsal or posterior spinocerebellar pathway and an anterior or ventral spinocerebellar pathway. And these are going to be found on the lateralmost aspect of that lateral white column. Of course, the dorsal spinocerebellar pathway is going to be found dorsally, and the anterior ventral spinocerebellar pathway is going to be found anterior or ventral. So let's get these labeled. Okay, so we have our dorsal spinocerebellar tract and our ventral spinocerebellar tract. Now, when we go into the details of the pathways, you can see that they're comprised of three specific neurons: a first order, a second order, and a third order neuron. So in this case, let's take a look at the dorsal column pathway and look at how the first order, second order, and third order neurons are arranged. So the first order neuron, this is going to be found in the peripheral nervous system. This is actually taking that information from the sensory receptor and carrying it through the peripheral nerves past our dorsal root ganglion, where we're going to have the cell body for the first order neuron, and into the spinal cord. In this example, let's say this is coming from the upper limb. It's going to carry the information up through the fasciculus cuneatus, where it reaches all the way up to the medulla of the brainstem. Here, we're going to have a nucleus cuneatus, where it's going to synapse with the second order neuron in the chain. So from here, it's going to synapse with the second order neuron. The second order neuron then decussates and crosses over, and then ascends through the medial lemniscal pathway all the way up to the thalamus. So here at the thalamus, this is where we're going to synapse on the third order neuron, which is then going to carry that signal to the primary somatosensory cortex. So it's important to note that this pathway is not the exact pathway for all sensory pathways. This is just an example, and this is for the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. When we're talking about, sensation coming from the face, we don't have dorsal root ganglions. We actually have a trigeminal ganglion. So the first order neuron ganglion is actually going to be found in the trigeminal ganglion, not the dorsal root ganglion. And in this example, we had our second order neuron located in the brainstem. Now, the second order neuron can actually be located also in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord before it synapses, and then that second order neuron ascends upwards. This is what you'll see in the spinothalamic pathway. However, both pathways that we're going to be looking at both have their third order neurons located in the ventral posterior lateral aspect of the thalamus, and they both send that signal to the primary somatosensory cortex. But anyways, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoy that. In this video, we looked at an overview of the different sensory modalities, as well as the different neurons which comprise the sensory pathways. In subsequent videos, we'll go more in depth into these individual pathways and how they're actually structured. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in the next one.